Welcome to today's Explainer. We are stepping way back in time and literally right into the belly of the beast. We're exploring the cramped, deafening, and frankly, terrifying metal box that was the very first armored personnel carrier in history. By looking at detailed historical cross-sections, we're going to peel back the heavy steel siding of these pioneering machines to reveal the harrowing daily life of the soldiers trapped inside. We're going to examine the stark realities of crossing a World War I battlefield, not as an infantryman exposed in the mud, but as a passenger locked inside a primitive experimental juggernaut. Let's dive in. So could you survive being trapped in a violently shaking, oven-like metal box during a war? I want you to really think about this for a second. Imagine the scene outside. The battlefield is a scarred wasteland covered in thick, choking smoke. Heavy artillery is raining down, turning the earth into a chaotic soup of mud and shrapnel. And right in the middle of all that, you're locked inside a massive, moving steel vault. Inside, it's sweltering, it's unbelievably noisy, it's ridiculously cramped, and every single impact, every crater your vehicle drops into shakes your body to its very core. That is the immersive, claustrophobic reality we're unpacking today. Okay, before we get into the grim details of the interior, let's establish our foundation. An APC, or Armored Personnel Carrier, is fundamentally a vehicle designed to transport soldiers safely through dangerous battlefields. But in the early days of mechanized warfare, safety was a highly relative term. Yes, the thick armor plating kept the deadly machine gun fire and lethal shrapnel off your back, but the environment inside was a completely different kind of battlefield. The soldiers within were constantly waging a war against the very machine that was designed to protect them. Section 1. Boarding the metal box. Getting into an early APC was a grueling physical challenge that began before the vehicle even moved an inch. Soldiers didn't just board empty-handed, they were burdened with a massive amount of gear. We're talking incredibly heavy weapons, bulky ammunition packs slung right across their chests, their daily food rations, and a ton of rigid combat equipment. Carrying all this bulk, they had to awkwardly hoist themselves up and violently squeeze through incredibly small, unforgiving steel hatches. It was a chaotic scramble. And once they essentially forced their way inside the metal hull, every single inch of available space was utilized, packing them in tight with absolutely zero room for personal comfort or adjustment. Section 2. Inside the compartments. When we look at the internal cross-section, we see a stark, unforgiving division of space. Up at the very front sat the driver's position, tasked with the immense responsibility of navigating a blasted, cratered war zone. The driver was severely restricted. They had to peer through tiny, narrow viewing slits that barely offered a glimpse of the chaos outside, let alone a clear path. Now contrast that with the rear section. Most of the internal volume was reserved for the infantry troops, but reserved definitely does not mean spacious. They were packed tightly together, sitting shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee. It was the suffocating mass of nervous energy, heavy wool uniforms, and cold steel, with the soldiers completely blind to the outside world. Zero. I mean literally zero room to stretch your legs. The soldiers sat locked in fixed, rigid positions along the interior benches. Imagine holding a severely cramped posture for hours on end while your muscles ache, your gear digs into your sides, and the heavy vehicle unpredictably lurches beneath you. You couldn't stand up, you couldn't lean back, and you honestly couldn't even shift your weight without knocking into the guy sitting right next to you. The psychological toll of this absolute physical confinement, especially while driving slowly into mortal danger, is just hard to comprehend. Section 3. Heat, Noise, and Hazards. You see, the soldiers weren't just fighting the enemy outside. They were literally fighting the machine itself. Positioned right there in the hull alongside the men was a massive, primitive internal combustion engine. This monstrous beast of a motor generated tremendous radiating heat and a deafening, continuous mechanical roar that made talking entirely impossible. And because this was a completely experimental, early design, internal ventilation was a total afterthought. The toxic exhaust fumes, the choking smell of hot oil, and the relentless mechanical screeching created an overwhelming, inescapable sensory nightmare for the men trapped inside. On hot days, the inside felt like an oven. With poor ventilation and thick steel walls soaking up the midday sun, temperatures inside would rapidly skyrocket to dangerous, sweltering levels. The visual of heat waves physically radiating off that massive, unshielded engine block right into the enclosed troop compartment is just terrifying. It turned the vehicle into a literal steel furnace.
It was a suffocating environment, heavily testing the physical and mental endurance of the crew before a single shot was ever fired in their direction. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were for sure just as dangerous as the enemy trenches.
Section 4. Surviving Majority. The battlefield environment was rarely, if ever, smooth. The APC had to violently plow its massive tracks through deep, sucking mud that threatened to bog it down. It had to pitch steeply up and down over jagged infantry trenches and crash brutally through massive artillery shell craters. Every single physical obstacle outside translated to a violent, bone-rattling shake for the men trapped within the hall. With absolutely no suspension to speak of and no seatbelts, they were essentially tossed around like rag dolls in a tin can, slamming into each other and the hard steel walls with every single bump. This created a grand, brutal irony for the passengers. Inside, the suffering was immense. You endured long, agonizing periods of waiting in the dark, experiencing violent shaking that caused terrible motion sickness, all while baking in unbearable oven-like heat. But externally, that thick armor was doing exactly what it was designed to do, seamlessly deflecting heavy machine gun fire and lethal artillery shrapnel that would have otherwise decimated an advancing infantry line. It was a horrific trade-off. The armor undoubtedly saved their lives from the enemy, but the terrible price of that survival was an agonizing, suffocating ride through hell.
The rhythm of daily life inside the APC was wildly unpredictable and honestly nerve-wracking. First, there were these agonizingly long periods of waiting. Just sitting in the sweltering heat, listening to the muffled, terrifying sounds of war raging outside as your anxiety built up. Then, the grinding tracks would suddenly stop. The vehicle would lurch to a halt directly at the front lines. Instantly, the troops experienced a chaotic burst of pure adrenaline. As the heavy doors and hatches flew open, they had to transition in a split second from cramped, exhausted stillness to explosive combat speed, pouring out of the vehicle and directly into the blinding light and the line of fire.
Section 5. The Modern APC Legacy. The evolutionary path of these incredible machines is direct and pretty fascinating. We started in the World War I era with primitive, cramped metal boxes, which were essentially just heavily armored farming tractors. But hey, they proved a highly vital concept. Moving into the mid-century, these early terrifying designs laid the absolute foundation for military troop transport, prioritizing rapid battlefield mobility and critical infantry protection. That harsh evolution leads us directly to the modern day, where APCs are highly advanced, air-conditioned, technologically sophisticated armored vehicles. They've come a remarkably long way from the suffocating, rattling steel ovens of their ancestors.
So, considering the intense claustrophobia, the blinding darkness, the deafening engine roar, the violent shaking, and that suffocating oven-like heat, how would you have handled the ride in history's first APC? It truly puts into perspective the incredible superhuman endurance of those early soldiers who paved the way for modern mechanized warfare. The next time you see a modern armored vehicle on the news or in a documentary, remember the brutal, cramped reality of the pioneers who rode in the very first ones. Thank you for joining this deep dive on today's Explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.